for Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Bhimrao Ambedkar, it was, through the means of political empowerment that, the psychological dimension of untouchability can be addressed. And for that, he also had set up three political parties at three different points of time, during his career as a leader of the uh, you know depressed classes, and of course he would be different in his approach from other political leaders like Gandhi. So that we will see, how it would be. But subsequently, after India's independence, when he comes as a member of the Constituent Assembly and becomes chairman of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution and India's first law minister, then we will see that a lot of his instances, a lot of his earlier stands on the method of representation, especially for the depressed classes, and the nature of state that would undergo change. So this is what we intend doing. First, we will try to see that how initially he suggests a different kind of political approach, which would be, in his opinion, effective to give political representation to the depressed classes. That is one. And the second, we will see that how he analyzes the whole issue of caste and untouchability. That is two. And finally, we will see that what different aspects he considers to be important for addressing this problem of untouchability and discrimination linked to caste in India society. Now, when we see Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, in his understanding, political representation is important, primarily because it is through the means of political representation that laws can be formulated in a manner which would safeguard the interest of the depressed classes. So, of course, he is trying to look at bringing about changes through legal means, and that is where an institution like Parliament would be effective instrument in his understanding, in his thought. So certainly he was looking at parliamentary democracy as an effective means to bring about changes. And since laws would be formulated by the parliament, then a law which would be favorable to protect the interest of the depressed classes, that would also require that the depressed classes are effectively represented in the parliament. So that is where representation is something which he would give a lot of emphasis to, as far as the whole process of bringing about changes and his understanding of reformation in India's society, especially the caste hierarchy that would be concerned. Now, initially, he would be of the view that if there would be guaranteed representation to the members of the depressed classes, then this is how representation can be ensured. That is how representation can be ensured. So that is where state would possibly play an important role, right? Important role in terms of guaranteeing representation to the members of the depressed classes in proportion to the population, right? In proportion to the population. So the way other castes or other communities would be represented in terms of their proportion to the population, this similar representation may happen in the case of the depressed classes. But this has to be in the form of some guaranteed number of seats, and wherein the number of elected representatives would be in the same proportion, the point I made earlier, to that of the population, which would be applicable to other communities as well. But somewhere he starts developing the idea that there should be a separate electorate for the depressed classes, and it is on this issue that he develops differences with Gandhi. Earlier he thought that if number one, the number of seats should be guaranteed, and number two, there would be universal adult franchise. So that's how depressed classes would get the required representation for the purpose of bringing about legislative changes, and through the means of legislative changes, there can be the required changes in the social sphere as well. But later on, towards the round table conferences, that happens between 1930 and 1932, he starts asserting that there has to have separate electorate for the depressed classes. And that is where the point I made earlier, that he develops differences with Gandhi, because Gandhi thought that once separate electorate is executed in the case of the members of the depressed classes, then in Gandhi's understanding, they would be out of the Hindu fold forever. So he did not want them to be treated as a category separate from Hindus. So it is on that point that Gandhi starts his fast unto death while he was in Aravada prison in Pune, and then Pune Pact happens in 1932, and Ambedkar somehow agrees that there would be some seats reserved for the members of the depressed classes, but there would not be separate electorate. So that is how we see that Ambedkar is trying to look at the whole issue of representation, and how, in his understanding, effective political representation is significant in terms of bringing about social changes. So we'll see that at the same time, Ambedkar was also trying to develop a different approach towards religion, and it is somewhere around 1936 that Ambedkar had declared that he would take a different identity, and a conference was to happen in 1936. But this is also the period where 1935 Government of India Act had been enacted, and there was a process which would lead to elections in 1937. So it is at that point of time we see that Ambedkar establishes Independent Labour Party, and that's the first political party that Ambedkar would set up. And if we look at the nature of this political party, then he would declare the objectives of the party to serve the interest of the labor class as a whole, the depressed class as a whole. So therein one would find that it is not simply in terms of caste that Ambedkar is looking at the role of Independent Labour Party. And what actually happens that in the elections of 1937, in Bombay presidency, of course, Ambedkar's party would manage to win some seats, but in some of the seats which would be open, which would be general in nature. So therein, the candidates from his party, they would lose, and post-election, Ambedkar would find that his party did not have the sufficient political support to steer through the desired legislation in the direction that he wanted. So that is where we will find that Ambedkar finds himself at difference with members of the Congress, right? Which he rather finds to be a little conservative in their approach, and this is how he would look at. This is how he would look at, right? ओके अब सबको आवाज आ रही है? एक किसी ने मैसेज भेजा है कि आवाज नहीं आ रही है. आप सब लोग आवाज सुन पा रहे हैं?
यस सर.
ओके, राहुल आप सुन पा रहे हैं?
यस सर, आ रही है.
अच्छा, ओके राहुल सुन पा रहे हैं?
लेकिन थोड़ी कट के आ रही.
अच्छा, ओके ठीक है, हम कोशिश करते हैं अपने एंड पे.
Sir, what did you said about the seats?
No, seats.
Why they were insufficient?
No, because Ambedkar's political party could not get enough seats compared to Congress, because Congress had got the majority, right? Not Ambedkar's party. And even in some of the areas where Ambedkar had expected that his candidate would win, in fact, it was a Dalit member from Congress party who managed to win. So that is where the Independent Labour Party of Ambedkar could not get the required number, which would be a force which would be in a position to influence the legislative process. So that is where Ambedkar understands that he would be unable to steer through the required legislation, and which he desired to bring about social reformation, right? Social reformation. So that is what we will see. See, actually, what we will see that, as far as Ambedkar was concerned, the point I had made earlier, that Ambedkar was very much, and again, this point I would come to later. Ambedkar was very much certain that as far as the depressed classes were concerned, they should be represented by a leader from among the depressed classes only. So that is something, that is something we will come back to again when we are trying to look at the whole approach which Ambedkar thinks would address the whole issue of untouchability in Indian society, right? So I will come back to that again. But point actually happens that if you look at the whole objective of this Independent Labour Party, so this would be more socialist in its approach, wherein emphasis would be on a state-controlled industry, larger scale industrialization, to address the problem of employment, to regulate the working hours for the laborers. The state is expected to play an important role as far as the education is concerned. Primary education is to be free and compulsory for all. So these are the the objectives that one finds in Ambedkar's Independent Labour Party, right? But the point, as I made earlier, that due to lack of sufficient strength, Ambedkar would find it difficult to influence the legislative process, and later on, Ambedkar would be made member of, rather the Labour member of Viceroy's Executive Council, and that is where he would do some work which would be for the general welfare, and one thing he could do again, that he could get the recognition for the Mahars, that's the community to which he belonged. So he could get the recognition for Mahars, to be part of the British Army. So in between, the Britishers had decided that there would not be a separate Mahar regiment. Mahar regiment still exists, in Indian Army. But this is what Ambedkar would do, and Most of his other acts would be